But here's what we know for the past million years or so, Earth has been going through these 100,000-year climate cycles. A slow buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, then relatively rapid melting, then another slow buildup. And during the cold phases, the world became a stage for some of the most incredible animals ever to walk the planet. The megafauna, that's what we call them. And the word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilos or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which says that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger because a bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Less surface area relative to volume means less heat loss. So, bigger bodies stay warm more efficiently in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. And the most famous one, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't actually as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but they were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with two layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a meter long in places and provided insulation so good that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. And they had a layer of fat up to 9 mm thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation. And their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe. This unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were fine-tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 meters tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and incredibly digging burrows. We found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 meters long with claw marks on the walls that matched their fossilized claws perfectly. There were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying. And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 meters tall on their hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. The world once belonged to giants. Imagine bone-crushing jaws, perfectly evolved for a frozen planet. For hundreds of thousands of years, a 100,000-year cycle of ice ages repeated, ice sheets growing, megafauna thriving, followed by a melt, the expansion of forests, and then the whole thing starting all over. But then, about 11,700 years ago, something shifted. The ice melted as it always had, but this time, most of the megafauna didn't survive. Within a few thousand years, they vanished. I've often wondered about this. Why did the cycle that sustained them for so long suddenly fail? Was the warming too rapid? Or had humans, evolving and spreading through these cycles, finally developed the technology and the numbers to hunt these incredible animals to extinction? Perhaps it was a combination of both. I want to take you back to the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago. This was the coldest point of that 100,000-year cycle, when the ice sheets were at their peak. The world was unrecognizable. Ice covered all of Canada, reaching down into the northern United States in places up to 3 kilometers thick. To give you a sense of that, imagine stacking the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, on top of itself more than 3 times. But instead of steel and glass, it's solid ice, covering an area the size of a continent. The weight of all that ice was so immense that it pressed down on the Earth's crust, deforming the solid rock beneath. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. In total, we're talking about maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. If you took all that ice and spread it evenly over the entire land surface of the Earth, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere, an almost incomprehensible amount of water, frozen solid. With so much water locked up on land, sea levels dropped by 120 meters. That's the height of a 40-story building. Coastlines extended far beyond where they are today. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, now thousands of islands, was mostly a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent. And between Alaska and Siberia, where the Bering Strait is now, there was a huge grassy plain called Beringia. The world map looked utterly different. But it wasn't just the coastlines that changed. The climate was totally different. It wasn't just colder, it was drier, much drier. With so much water locked in ice, and with colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded, rainforests shrank to tiny pockets. What's now the Amazon basin was much drier, probably a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even bigger than it is today. Large parts of the world were covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that flowed off the ice in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground and carried it hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Some parts of China have dust deposits over 100 meters thick that accumulated during glacial periods. I can only imagine the dust storms, blotting out the sun for days at a time. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and wind-swept. And yet life not only survived here, it thrived. The megafauna weren't just barely scraping by, they were dominating these ecosystems, existing in numbers that probably matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swaths of the northern hemisphere. This was a unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs that could handle cold, dry conditions. It supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in huge herds. What an incredible sight that must have been. Mammoths were the most iconic, but they weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceroses were just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold. They had thick woolly coats and two horns, the front one sometimes over a meter long. They used these horns as snow plows to clear away snow and reach the vegetation underneath. We've found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. And like mammoths, they show clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths dominated the Americas. Modern sloths are cute, slow-moving animals that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, had an estimated body mass of 3,800 kilograms. That's heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets really interesting. We found their burrows, actual tunnels, dug into hillsides, some of them 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. I still can't quite wrap my mind around the idea of multi-ton sloths emerging from underground tunnels. It sounds like something from a fantastical tale, yet it's undeniably real. The ceilings and walls of these burrows bear claw marks that perfectly match those of ground sloths. Scientists believe these giant creatures dug these burrows either to escape the extreme temperatures of the Ice Age or to find refuge from predators. Then there were the glyptodonts, bizarre relatives of modern armadillos, but blown up to truly ridiculous proportions. They could weigh up to 2 tons, lumbering around on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were encased in shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, much like a turtle shell, but far larger and heavier. These shells could be over 1.5 meters long, tough enough to deter almost any predator. Some species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes, essentially a medieval mace attached to their bodies. Biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, transforming these armored tanks into upright figures swinging spiked tails as weapons. The sheer diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is staggering. In North America alone, there were mammoths, mastodons, American horses and camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. South America boasted even more ground sloth species, glyptodonts, giant armadillos, toxodons, which resembled hippo-sized rodent relatives, and Macrauchenia, which looked like a strange cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. Eurasia had its own array of megafauna, including mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, and giant deer called megaloceros, with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters. And of course, wherever you find large herbivores, you'll find large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are perhaps the most famous Ice Age predators. The Smilodon in the Americas possessed those incredible canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone. They were precision killing tools. Saber-tooths would use their powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-tooths are among the most common carnivores found there. This suggests they were successful predators, likely living in social groups like modern lions preying on bison, young mammoths, horses, and giant ground sloths. Formidable animals indeed. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and likely hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite their name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were enormous, weighing up to half a ton, and their sheer size made them a force to be reckoned with. And then there were the giant short-faced bears in North America, possibly the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, encountering one would have been a terrifying prospect. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, suggesting they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors, searching for carrion. And there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But what's truly fascinating is that all these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space. Predators hunted herbivores, scavengers cleaned up the remains, and plants evolved to withstand grazing press. It was all interconnected, And the megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals lived together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils, and this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. The world of the Ice Age was constantly changing, responding to shifts in climate across vast stretches of time. It's a world almost impossible to imagine now. Humans were a part of this world, too. Our ancestors hunted alongside mammoths, competed with predators, and adapted their cultures to survive the glacial conditions. Neanderthals, for example, had already lived through countless cycles in Europe. They were remarkably adapted to the cold, with stocky builds and large nasal cavities to warm the frigid air. They crafted sophisticated tools, hunted the megafauna, mastered fire, and even developed symbolic rituals and art. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe, bringing new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. For thousands of years, we overlapped with Neanderthals, sharing the landscape and its giant creatures. Genetic evidence now reveals that we even interbred. Most people of European or Asian descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. In other parts of the world, modern humans were also adapting to Ice Age conditions, coexisting with megafauna in Asia, Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually the Americas. The interaction between humans and megafauna is one of the most debated topics in Ice Age research, and we will dig into that more later. But for now, just imagine the sheer strangeness of life during peak glaciation. To stand at the edge of the last glacial maximum, looking out over a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands with mammoths, rhinos, and giant sloths lumbering through it, it's witnessing something that will probably never exist again. These ecosystems are gone now. The megafauna are extinct. The mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world. That world was shaped by the 100,000-year cycle. The cold phases created the very conditions to which life adapted. For hundreds of thousands of years, this pattern repeated. Cold phase, megafauna thrive. Warm phase, forests expand. Cold phase again, megafauna return. It was a rhythm that life on Earth had grown accustomed to. Then, about 19,000 years ago, something began to shift. The orbital cycles moved into a configuration that favored warming. Northern hemisphere summers grew stronger, the ice sheets began to melt, and what followed would change everything. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent Earth history. Caught in the middle of that transition were all these megafauna, evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most of them wouldn't survive. So, we've talked about what these Ice Age giants looked like. Let's get into the details of how they actually lived, because the more we learn about these animals, the more incredible they become. Some of the discoveries are genuinely surprising. Scientists matched these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, and they fit exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering huge underground structures for animals weighing 800 to 1,200 kilograms. This is incredible behavior. Why were they doing it? The leading theories are either temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground, temperatures are much more stable than on the surface. If you're trying to escape extreme heat or cold, a burrow makes sense. Or maybe they were hiding from predators like saber-toothed cats or giant short-faced bears. When you're big but not fast, going underground where predators can't easily follow you is a smart strategy. Either way, it shows these animals were way more behaviorally complex than we might expect from something called a giant sloth. Here's another fascinating discovery about ground sloths. In Ecuador, at a site called Tanque Loma, paleontologists found the remains of at least 22 Erematherium sloths of various ages, all in the same location. They likely died during a drought, getting trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But the cool part is what this tells us about their behavior. They were congregating at watering holes, which means they were social animals living in groups. And they were probably wallowing in the water to escape heat and insects, similar to how hippos and rhinos behave today. Wait, Wall. It's incredible to think that even during the Ice Age, warmth persisted in some places. Tropical and subtropical regions still experienced warm seasons, even if the overall climate was cooler and drier than what we know today. These equatorial havens meant animals still had to cope with heat. It reminds me of ground sloths in South America, employing the same strategies as large African mammals do now to beat the heat. It's a powerful reminder that the Ice Age wasn't a planet uniformly frozen. Speaking of fascinating survivors, mammoths continue to amaze me. The specimens preserved in Siberian permafrost have revealed so much. Imagine finding their last meals perfectly preserved in their stomachs: grasses, sedges, herbs, flowers, mosses. A window into the mammoth steppe ecosystem and the plants available to them. And it goes deeper than that. We've sequenced entire mammoth genomes from these frozen remains. The genetic analysis has revealed some incredible adaptations. For example, mammoths had unique versions of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in blood, that functioned far better in cold temperatures. Normal hemoglobin struggles to release oxygen efficiently when it's cold, a critical problem for an animal in freezing conditions. Mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that compensated, ensuring effective oxygen delivery even when their body tissues were cold. It's a hardcore molecular adaptation to cold environments. And beyond that, mammoths possess genes for small ears, sparse sweat glands, and improved fat storage, all coded in their DNA. Evolution didn't just tweak their appearance, it rewired their physiology at the genetic level. What I find particularly poignant is the story of the last mammoths clinging to existence on Wrangler Island in the Arctic Ocean. This island became isolated as sea levels rose after the ice sheets melted. A population of around 500 to 1,000 mammoths survived there until about 4,000 years ago. That's after the pyramids of Giza were built during the Bronze Age. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. The last of these giants roamed a remote Arctic island while humans in Egypt were building monuments and developing writing. Ultimately, they went extinct, likely due to inbreeding, habitat degradation on their small island, and perhaps climate change or the arrival of humans. It marked the end of an evolutionary line that had endured for millions of years. The woolly rhinoceros is another species that we know so much about because of frozen specimens. Like mammoths, they had thick woolly coats, perfectly suited for the cold. Their behavior, however, differed, as revealed by tooth wear and bone isotopes. Scientists believe woolly rhinos were more selective eaters than mammoths. Mammoths were bulk grazers, consuming whatever vegetation was available, while woolly rhinos seemed pickier, likely using their horns to dig through snow for specific plants. And then there's the giant deer Megaloceros, with antlers that were, quite frankly, insane. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 312 meters from tip to tip, wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 4 kilograms. Just imagine the neck and shoulder muscles needed to carry that weight. These massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, much like modern deer use their antlers. During mating season, males would flaunt their antlers to females and use them in battles with rivals. Bigger antlers meant a more impressive display, but those antlers came at a cost. Growing them demanded huge amounts of calcium and energy, and simply carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are another fascinating case. Despite their name and size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones reveals a diet primarily of plants. They were built like grizzly bears but behaved more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe contain thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or even thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. Interestingly, cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons remain unclear, but it may have been due to competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of these factors. But it's the glyptodonts that are truly blowing my mind the more I learn about them. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, as we mentioned before, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging, similar to modern armadillos, but scaled up massively. These armored giants might have dug burrows like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armored animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was truly wild, and the predators of the Ice Age were just as specialized as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats, for instance, didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls reveal they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats. But their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. Their hunting strategy likely involved using their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down, then using their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly with precision. It wasn't about crushing force. It was about precision. I've always been fascinated by the dire wolf. Thousands of them, individuals trapped in sticky asphalt over tens of thousands of years. The La Brea tar pits, a graveyard of the Ice Age. But within that tragedy, a story emerges. Fossil evidence shows many dire wolf specimens with broken teeth, healed fractures, and signs of arthritis, especially in older individuals. It suggests they lived in social groups that cared for injured or elderly members. A wolf with a broken leg or missing teeth can't hunt effectively on its own, but if the pack shares food, they can survive. The fossil evidence suggests dire wolves had complex social structures similar to modern wolves. Giant short-faced bears are still mysterious in some ways. Were they primarily predators or scavengers? The evidence is mixed. Their long legs suggest they could cover long distances efficiently, which would be useful for scavenging, but their powerful jaws and teeth could definitely kill prey. They might have been opportunistic, hunting when possible and scavenging when available. Their sheer size, potentially the largest mammalian land predator ever, suggests they could intimidate smaller predators and steal their kills. Imagine a pack of dire wolves bringing down a bison only to have a giant short-faced bear show up and chase them off to claim the carcass. One of the coolest things about Ice Age ecosystems is that we have evidence of how they functioned from an unusual source, ancient DNA in sediments. Even when there are no bones or visible fossils, DNA from animals can be preserved in frozen soil. Scientists have developed techniques to extract and identify this environmental DNA, and it's revealed which species were present in different places at different times. This has filled in gaps in the fossil record and shown us that Ice Age ecosystems were even more diverse than we realized. For example, we now know that horses were present in areas where we don't have horse fossils because we found horse DNA in the soil. We've identified plants that grew in certain regions by finding their pollen and DNA. We can even tell what the climate was like by looking at which species of plants and insects were present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in genetic code. Humans were observing and interacting with all of this megafauna, and they left records of what they saw. Cave art from sites like Lascaux in France and Chauvet Cave shows remarkably accurate depictions of Ice Age animals. The artists painted mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions, and more. These paintings aren't crude stick figures. They're sophisticated artworks showing animals in motion, using the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent a lot of time observing these animals to capture them so accurately. Some cave paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. There's a famous painting of a woolly rhino that clearly shows its thick fur and the way it held its head. There are paintings of mammoths that show their characteristic domed heads and long tusks. These artworks are our direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Humans also left behind butchered animal bones showing clear cut marks from stone tools, mammoth bones with spear points embedded in them, campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record proves that humans hunted megafauna and relied on them for food, materials for tools and clothing, and fat for fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art objects and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwelling structures in areas with scarce wood. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence that humans might have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, humans could prevent forests from encroaching on grasslands, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, not just predator and prey. The 100,000-year cycle had created this entire world. The cold phase of the cycle produced these unique ecosystems and drove the evolution of specialized megafauna adapted to frozen conditions. For hundreds of thousands of years, the pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced. Megafauna thrived. Ice sheets retreated. Forests expanded. Ice sheets advanced again. Life adapted to this rhythm. But then, about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again. And this time, something was different. This time, humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold like they had for hundreds of thousands of years. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever, and we're still debating exactly why. So, around 19,000 years ago, the 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted into a pattern that favored warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation. And when that happens, winter snow starts melting more completely each summer. Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. But deglaciation isn't a smooth process, not at all. It's more like a series of fits and starts, marked by sudden collapses and temporary reversals. There are periods of incredibly rapid change, changes that would have been noticeable even within a single human lifetime. This messiness is what makes understanding the extinction of the megafauna so complicated. The first major pulse of melting began around 19,000 years ago and continued for thousands of years. As the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose. During one period, around 14,600 years ago, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, sea levels rose by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters might not sound like much, but that's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transformed coastlines. All that water came from collapsing sections of the great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, that massive dome of ice covering Canada, began breaking apart, as did the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe. As they melted, they left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. It must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions, the most famous being the Younger Dryas event. Around 14 to 700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years. Ice sheets were in retreat. Things seemed to be heading toward interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, possibly faster. Some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself, and when that ice dam failed, geological evidence suggests it did multiple times. Absolutely stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive freshwater dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's this ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's basically a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere. But fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC, and when the AMOC stops, the northern hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics. Temperatures crash, and you're back to near glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter, temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation. It had major impacts on human societies, too. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to end food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, then this climate event triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. But eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The Amo Sea kicked back into gear. Heat flooded northward again. Ice sheets resumed their collapse. And this time, there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding. Grasslands were shrinking. The climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis. The extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. It was a devastating event, this quaternary extinction. Europe, too, saw similar losses, though the precise timing seems to vary from species to species. The woolly mammoths, for instance, disappeared from most places, managing to hold on only in isolated spots like Wrangler Island. The woolly rhinos vanished, the cave lions were gone, and the giant deer died out. The megafauna that had dominated Europe during the Ice Age were either gone completely or their numbers severely reduced. South America suffered similar losses. Giant ground sloths, all the different species that had evolved there, simply vanished. The glyptodonts were gone. Native horses and camels went extinct. Toxodons, macrauchenia, and giant armadillos, all gone. The extinction wave swept through the Americas like wildfire. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna even earlier, somewhere between 50 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, even a marsupial lion, all disappeared. Interestingly, the timing in Australia seems to coincide more with the arrival of humans than with the last deglaciation, which only adds another layer to the puzzle of what caused these extinctions. So, what killed them? That's the question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main schools of thought: the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably a combination of both, with the relative importance of each varying by region and by species. The climate change hypothesis argues that the rapid warming and the ecosystem transformation were simply more than these animals could handle. These megafauna had evolved for cold, open habitats, and when those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. As forests expanded and grasslands shrank, the megafauna populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. And small, isolated populations are incredibly vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and random environmental fluctuations. This creates a kind of extinction vortex, where declining populations face multiple threats that compound each other, making recovery impossible. There's definitely good evidence for climate being a major factor. The extinctions happened during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates, like the woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. That pattern alone suggests that climate played a significant role. Also, the megafauna had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If the megafauna survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis comes in. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age. And humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, which are spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power, sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. And critically, many of these megafauna had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters when humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia. The local megafauna hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were, in essence, naive prey. Modern examples show this pattern clearly. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same thing might have happened with the Ice Age megafauna. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was far too late. And here's the thing about hunting megafauna. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth, for example, might have a calf only every 5 years. And mammoths don't even reach sexual maturity until their teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the entire population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few percent of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries or millennia. And we know humans hunted megafauna. We've found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps and then butchered, even cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable that humans hunted these animals. The real question is whether hunting alone could cause extinctions, or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is really suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the megafauna were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzac child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 12,700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analyzed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother, and they found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialized mammoth predators, like scimitar cats. This suggests that Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialized mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzac child is just one individual. We can't say that all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants, it wasn't a simple story. It wasn't just about humans hunting mammoths to extinction, though that played a role. And it wasn't only about climate change, though that, too, exerted immense pressure. It was the combination of these factors, the warming climate fragmenting habitats, and human hunting preventing the recovery of already weakened populations, that created a perfect storm. There's still so much debate, even now. How many people were there, really? Could small groups have truly hunted mammoths across an entire continent? Some scientists remain skeptical. The patterns of extinction themselves are varied and complex. Some species vanished early, while others held on for longer. The mammoths on Wrangel Island, for example, survived until about 4,000 years ago. Thousands of years after their mainland cousins disappeared, cave bears went extinct before many other species, while dire wolves vanished, but gray wolves survived. Bison, despite being heavily hunted, also managed to persist. The reasons why some species made it while others didn't are still being investigated. There were indirect effects as well, I think. Humans extensively used fire to manage the landscape, altering vegetation patterns. And the loss of the megafauna themselves had profound impacts on the ecosystem. Mammoths and other large herbivores acted as ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they disappeared, those grasslands transformed into forests, making the habitat even less suitable for any remaining megafauna. It was a cascade of interconnected effects. For hundreds of thousands of years, these 100,000-year cycles sustained the megafauna. During cold phases, they thrived. During warm phases, they retreated to refugia. But this time, as the cycle shifted to warming, there was a new element in the equation: humans, with their sophisticated hunting technology and growing populations. This combination of rapid climate change and human press proved to be more than most megafauna could withstand. And within just a few thousand years, the Ice Age world of giants was gone forever. But let's turn our attention to the humans who lived through these cycles, because their story is just as fascinating. And when I say humans, I'm not just talking about our own species. We weren't the only ones around during the Ice Age. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors arrived, and they deserve so much more credit than they often receive. They were the original Ice Age survivors. They had evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, enduring glacial cycles long before modern humans ever left Africa. They weren't some brutish, primitive dead end. They were sophisticated, intelligent humans, incredibly well adapted to glacial conditions. Their adaptations were truly remarkable. Consider their body structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky, with barrel chests and thick, heavy bones. The average male stood only about 160 centimeters tall, yet they were built like tanks. They were incredibly muscular, with bones showing massive muscle attachment sites. This wasn't arbitrary. It was an adaptation to the cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, which means less heat loss. It's Bergmann's rule in action, the same principle that drove Ice Age megafauna to grow so large. In cold climates, compact bodies simply retain heat more effectively. Even their faces were distinctive, with large noses and wide nasal passages. These weren't just aesthetic features. Those big nasal cavities acted like built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid dry air before it reached the lungs. Breathing super cold air repeatedly can damage lung tissue, so this adaptation was crucial. We see the same adaptation in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, but the same solution to the same problem. Convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. Neanderthals possessed sophisticated culture and technology. They crafted complex stone tools using the Levallois technique, carefully preparing the core and then striking off flakes of predetermined shapes. This required planning and mental visualization. They had to see the finished tool in their mind before even beginning to work the stone. They also made wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears have been found preserved in German peat bogs, and they are truly beautiful examples of craftsmanship. Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. We found Neanderthal sites containing bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, and even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones bear clear butchery marks made with stone tools while the meat was still fresh. Neanderthals actively hunted animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That required coordination, communication, planning, and, of course, courage. They also used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for creating complex adhesives. Archaeologists have discovered Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. It's a multi-step process that demands technical knowledge and careful control. You can't just stumble upon this knowledge. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressively, Neanderthals had symbolic culture. They created ornamental objects, pierced shells, and eagle talons that were apparently worn as jewelry. They used pigments, possibly for body painting, or decorating objects, or cave walls, and they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. There's that famous burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, which includes evidence that might suggest flowers were placed in the grave, though the interpretation is still debated. But the care, the intention, it's undeniable. The mystery of the Neanderthals' disappearance has always captivated me. They were capable, well-adapted, and deeply human, even creating art. Abstract, geometric patterns and hand stencils found in Spanish caves, dating back to a time when Neanderthals were the sole inhabitants of the region. These markings, among the earliest known examples of cave art, push back the timeline of symbolic behavior. It wasn't just an isolated incident either. Similar markings have been discovered at multiple sites. suggesting it was a broader aspect of Neanderthal culture. The last Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago, coinciding with the spread of modern humans from Africa and the Middle East into Europe. Was it competition, interbreeding, direct conflict, or something else entirely? The genetic evidence confirms that interbreeding did occur. If you're of European or Asian descent, you likely carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. While it may seem small, it proves that our ancestors and Neanderthals had children together, and those children survived and reproduced. Some Neanderthal genes persist in us today, influencing immune function, skin and hair traits, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. So, in a way, Neanderthals weren't entirely wiped out, but rather absorbed into the modern human gene pool. However, as a distinct population with their own culture, they didn't survive. A major factor was probably demographics. Modern human populations seem to have been larger and more widespread. In a competition for resources, the larger population usually prevails through sheer numbers. Even if individual Neanderthals were as capable as modern humans, being outnumbered 10 to 1 would eventually lead to being overwhelmed. Modern humans also appear to have had technological advantages. While Neanderthals made excellent tools, modern humans developed more diverse and specialized toolkits. They crafted fine bone needles for sewing-fitted clothing, which offered better insulation than simply wrapping hides. They invented fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding their food sources. They also created more prolific art and ornaments, which might indicate more complex social structures or improved communication systems. Moreover, modern humans had wider trade networks. Materials found at modern human sites originated from hundreds of kilometers away, indicating extensive exchange of goods. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized. Trade isn't just about material possessions. It's about information exchange and social connections. Wider networks mean more shared ideas and innovations, accelerating cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers suggest that modern humans might have had slightly better language abilities, allowing for more complex planning and coordination, or perhaps different social structures that were more effective at acquiring resources or raising children. These are subtle differences that might not be obvious in archaeological remains, but over generations they could have compounded into significant advantages. Climate might have also played a role. The late Ice Age was climatically unstable, with rapid shifts between cold and warm periods. Perhaps Neanderthals, specialized for cold, stable conditions, struggled more with these rapid fluctuations. Modern humans, coming from Africa with its own climate variability, might have been more adaptable, but this remains speculative. What is clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. We were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer. By the end of the last glacial period, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica, surviving the 100,000-year cycle at its most extreme phase. Modern humans developed an impressive array of technologies during the late Ice Age. Projectile weapons were a game changer. Early humans initially used thrusting spears, which required getting close to prey, dangerous when hunting mammoth. Then they invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm, dramatically increasing throwing range and power. Suddenly, they could attack from tens of meters away, much safer. Later, probably between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago, in some regions, humans invented the bow and arrow. This was huge. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. They could carry more ammunition and hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history, fundamentally changing how humans could acquire food and defend themselves. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated as well. There's evidence of drive hunting, where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps. Sites with hundreds of bison or horses driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups of people, scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior that requires communication and planning. Fishing also became important. Humans developed harpoons, fish hooks made from bone, and nets, opening up aquatic resources as a crucial food source. Those cave paintings, when I first saw images of the art at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, I was stunned. They weren't crude at all, but sophisticated, dynamic images of animals. The skill and accuracy were incredible. During the Ice Age, humans relied heavily on fish and shellfish, especially in coastal and river areas. Fishing was less risky than hunting mammoths. Coastal sites reveal intensive use of these resources, with enormous shell heaps representing thousands of meals. Clothing technology also took a leap forward. Bone needles, appearing around 40,000 years ago, allowed for fitted clothing with sleeves and clothes. I've tried wrapping animal hides around myself for warmth, and let me tell you, it's not very effective. Fitted clothing traps body heat far better, which likely allowed humans to survive in colder regions and remain active during winter. Shelter evolved, too. In areas with little wood, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as frameworks, covered with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in Ukraine and Russia. Some used bones from dozens of mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These weren't temporary camps, but substantial dwellings, showing serious effort invested in creating comfortable, long-term living spaces. Beyond survival, Ice Age humans created stunning artwork. The artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects, mixing pigments to achieve different colors, and understanding techniques like shading and perspective. Some paintings even show animals in motion, capturing movement in a static image. And it wasn't just cave paintings. People carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The Venus figurines, stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period, some with elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. They made musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory, and created elaborate burials with grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing. One burial of children in Russia included so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort into it. Why did humans create art? Probably for many reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic plea or social bonding. The point is, Ice Age humans weren't just focused on survival. They had rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. They were fully modern mentally and behaviorally, even though they lived in incredibly harsh conditions. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge by modern standards, maybe just a few million people worldwide. But they had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe, and critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The populating of the Americas is fascinating. During peak glaciation, when sea levels were low, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. This wasn't just a narrow strip, but a vast region, probably thousands of kilometers wide, with its own ecosystems. Humans crossed it, probably following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago, but there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed, and remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated, but it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, and we developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next, the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story. The point is, the Ice Age and its 100,000-year cycle was the crucible that forged modern human behavior. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking, all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of glacial cycles. We are, in a very real sense, products of the Ice Age. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world, and now that world is gone, melted away as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. The question is, I often wonder if we're really suited for the world we inhabit today, or if we're just carrying baggage from an ice age that ended millennia ago. That cycle of 100,000 years has shifted dramatically. The ice has melted, the megafauna are mostly gone, and we humans find ourselves in a completely different world than our ancestors knew for hundreds of thousands of years. Welcome to the Holocene, our current interglacial period, a time when everything began to transform for human societies. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold snap finally ended and temperatures rose quickly, stabilizing into conditions much like what we experience today. The climate became warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded, spreading across areas that had once been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels continued to rise as the last major ice sheets melted, flooding coastlines and creating the geography we recognize. It was a dramatic and relatively fast transformation. For humans who had been living as hunter-gatherers, this new world presented both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, more diverse vegetation, and a more predictable climate. But on the other hand, the megafauna they had been hunting were disappearing. Those massive herds of mammoth, bison, and horses that had been reliable food sources were gone or going extinct. Humans had to adapt their subsistence strategies quickly, or they would face serious problems. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period show enormous shell middens and fish bone deposits, evidence of how stable and productive the ocean was, providing a reliable food source. In other regions, people focused more on smaller game like deer, rabbits, and birds, supplemented with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. These resources require different hunting techniques than megafauna hunting. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools, different strategies. But in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People started deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. This was the very beginning of agriculture, and it changed absolutely everything about human society. The first clear evidence of agriculture appears in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East around 11 to 10,000 years ago. People started cultivating wheat and barley and domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, Mose was domesticated around the same time in multiple regions independently, all within just a few thousand years of each other. Humans invented farming. Why did agriculture develop when it did? It's a question that's been debated for ages. One theory points to population pres. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations might have grown to the point where hunting and gathering simply couldn't support everyone. Agriculture produces more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, so it can support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate. Some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, the climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in the spring and be reasonably confident summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also a theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and just continued. Whatever triggered it, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, and it brought with it a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature, diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and moving frequently, your waste gets left behind, and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages, I find it humbling to consider that many of the diseases that plague us today, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, even influenza, originated in domestic animals. It was only after we began living in close quarters with livestock that these diseases made the jump. Farming, while revolutionary, made us far more vulnerable to epidemics. Yet, agriculture's overwhelming advantage was its capacity to support a far greater population per unit of land. A square kilometer of wheat fields could sustain dozens, even hundreds of people. The same area of wild land might only support a handful of hunter-gatherers. This disparity meant agricultural societies could grow exponentially, leading to more workers, soldiers, inventors, more of everything. When agricultural societies encountered hunter-gatherer societies, the farmers usually prevailed simply through greater numbers, even if individual hunter-gatherers were healthier or more skilled warriors. Over millennia, agriculture spread across most of the world where the climate allowed. Sometimes this occurred through the migration of farming peoples, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers. Other times, hunter-gatherers adopted farming from their agricultural neighbors. Either way, the majority of humanity transitioned from mobile hunting and gathering to sedentary farming, setting the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. Permanent settlements evolved into cities, which in turn demanded food from surrounding agricultural areas, leading to the development of trade networks. Trade necessitated record-keeping, which spurred the invention of writing independently in multiple regions. Complex societies developed hierarchies, with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and, tragically, slaves forming distinct social classes. Organized religion rose in prominence, marked by monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as individuals focused full-time on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration, rather than food production. The first civilizations arose in river valleys, where agriculture was particularly productive: Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of complex society. And all of this transpired within just a few thousand years after the end of the last ice age. The transformation from small, mobile, hunter-gatherer bands to cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants is breathtakingly rapid. But it's also crucial to remember that even as these civilizations flourished, hunter-gatherer societies continued to thrive in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples, for example, maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture was invented elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even as others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the San people hunted and gathered successfully until very recently, and some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was simply one strategy among many, one that proved highly successful at supporting large populations and complex societies, but not the only viable path. The ecological consequences of this Holocene transition were profound. It wasn't just about the extinction of megafauna. Forests expanded dramatically, reshaping countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands were forced to move, adapt, or face extinction. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to higher elevations, while warm-adapted species expanded their ranges. The distribution of species across the planet underwent a massive shift in just a few thousand years. And humans were increasingly shaping these ecosystems, often in ways we didn't fully grasp until recently. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted the growth of useful plants. This burning had profound effects on vegetation patterns. What we often perceive as natural, pristine ecosystems are, in fact, often anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed large areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained vast prairies and savannas that might otherwise have become forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew in where they hadn't been for millennia. Fire-adapted species declined, while fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans encountered wasn't pristine nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects that we are still working to understand. Megaherbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants. They were ecosystem engineers, They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, and created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared as well. Some scientists believe that forests expanded after the Ice Age, partly because there were no longer giant herbivores suppressing tree growth. There's even a hypothesis suggesting that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce significant amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, through their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions may have decreased significantly, and the transformation from open grasslands to forests changed the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. The loss of the megafauna had a profound effect on human societies, more than I initially realized. For millennia, we hunted these giants, our lives intertwined with theirs. Their extinction wasn't just a loss of food, it was a loss of resources. Mammoth ivory, for example, was essential for tools, art, and even construction. Their hides provided clothing and shelter. Bones? They were used for everything from needles to the frameworks of our dwellings. This forced us to find substitutes, likely driving technological innovations. In a way, the extinction of the megafauna might have accelerated the transition to agriculture in some regions. If your primary food source disappears and you can't find adequate replacements by hunting smaller game, starvation becomes a real threat. Agriculture then became that new strategy. The extinctions that ended the Ice Age world may have inadvertently pushed humans toward the lifestyles that would eventually lead to modern civilization. The Holocene, the geological epoch we're currently in, has been unusually stable compared to the climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene. There have been variations, of course, warm periods and cold periods, droughts and floods, but nothing like the dramatic swings of the Ice Age, with its rapid warming and cooling events. This stability, I believe, has been crucial in helping civilizations develop. It's hard to build cities and plan agriculture when the climate might flip dramatically within a single generation. But the Holocene's relative stability allowed humans to make long-term plans and investments, building irrigation systems and monumental architecture that took decades or even centuries to complete. Different parts of the world experienced the Holocene differently. The Sahara Desert, now a vast empty wasteland, was actually green and wet during the early Holocene. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed through what is now desert. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation covered areas that are now bare sand. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. Rock art from this period depicts hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that now seem impossibly out of place. But then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened and the Sahara dried out relatively rapidly. Within just a few centuries, the green Sahara became the desert we know today. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley, where water remained available. Some historians even think this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. Climate change, driving human migration, driving civilization development, It's all interconnected. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations. But droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations there. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to the collapse of Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial period. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models offer different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands of years. The orbital cycles are complex, and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card now: human activity. We are now affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple of centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question: what happens next? It's here that things get really interesting and, honestly, a bit scary. We've spent this whole time talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including humans. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it. And that species is us. Some scientists think we've already delayed or canceled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere, warming the planet, making it unlikely that northern hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation, even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometers of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem is, we're not just preventing the next ice age. We're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions, and we're doing it incredibly fast. So let's talk about what we've learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold, and boom, rapid dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is a perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate. Ice sheets don't simply melt in a uniform way. I've learned they can remain stable for extended periods, only to suddenly accelerate their melting when they reach certain critical points. It's a sobering thought, how delicately balanced these systems are. Ocean circulation patterns like the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation AMOC can weaken gradually, then potentially shut down relatively rapidly. Permafrost, frozen for millennia, can abruptly thaw, unleashing greenhouse gases that amplify warming. These aren't smooth, linear processes. They are systems where small additional press can trigger disproportionately large responses, and we're pushing multiple systems toward their tipping points simultaneously. Arctic sea ice is declining dramatically. The minimum extent in summer has dropped about 40% since satellite measurements began in the 1970s. Some models even suggest the possibility of ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And of course, there are those feedback loops. Ice reflects sunlight, but ocean water absorbs it. Less ice means more heat absorption, which leads to more warming, which in turn leads to more ice loss. It's self-reinforcing. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, around 250 billion tons per year in recent measurements. Greenland holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters, if it all melted. No one expects it to melt completely anytime soon, but even losing a fraction of it over the coming centuries would massively impact coastlines worldwide. And once major melting begins, feedback effects make it difficult to stop. Exposed, darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, causing it to flow faster. Warm ocean water gets underneath and melts the ice from below. All positive feedbacks amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning because much of it rests on bedrock below sea level. Warm ocean water is already getting underneath it, causing melting. Some scientists believe major portions might be committed to collapse over the coming centuries, even if we stopped warming today. If that happens, we're looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise. That would remake coastlines globally and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is being disrupted in ways that mirror the Ice Age cycles, but reversed and much faster. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide levels dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacial periods, they rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This roughly 100 parts per million swing took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. We've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million in just over a century. We're replicating the natural cycle's entire range in a tiny fraction of the time. And we're blowing past natural interglacial levels into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide levels were this high was probably during the Pliocene epoch, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than today. Sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's where we're headed if we don't change course. And the rate of change matters as much as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate. Evolution selects for new traits. Ecological communities reassemble. But when change happens in decades or centuries, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they go extinct. We're already seeing range shifts in thousands of species. Plants flowering earlier, animals moving toward the poles or up mountains, ocean species shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, others aren't, and we're likely headed for another extinction wave. Maybe not as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions, but significant, Current extinction rates are already elevated above background levels, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps scientists up at night. During Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations changed sunlight distribution. This affected temperature. Temperature changes affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during Ice Age cycles, they're still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers, and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds are. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws, and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Classic feedback. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause more warming. How fast this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is real and quite scary. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far, which has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen has dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems that support enormous biodiversity are collapsing. The climate is complicated, counterintuitive. Global warming could paradoxically cause regional cooling. That idea stayed with me for days when I first encountered it. It highlights just how sensitive and interconnected our planet's systems are. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMO, shows signs of weakening. The data is noisy, and it doesn't stretch back very far, but there are multiple lines of evidence suggesting that it might be slowing down. If it weakens significantly, or even shuts down entirely, it could cause regional cooling in parts of Europe. It's a reminder that even as the globe warms overall, some areas might experience localized cooling, just as happened during the Younger Dryas period. What do we do with this knowledge? Well, understanding the 100,000-year cycle teaches us that Earth's climate is incredibly sensitive to even relatively small changes. The orbital variations that trigger ice ages are, in the grand scheme of things, tiny changes in the seasonal distribution of sunlight. Yet, those small shifts are enough to tip the entire system from one state to another, especially when combined with feedback loops. We're currently applying a forcing to the climate system that is much larger and much faster than those natural orbital variations. The response, therefore, is going to be substantial. The only real questions are just how substantial and on what timescale. We also learn that climate has momentum. Ice sheets, for example, take thousands of years to grow, but they can collapse much more quickly. Once you start major melting, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. Changes in ocean circulation can also be hard to reverse. Some of the changes we're causing right now are essentially irreversible on human timescales. Even if we were to stop all emissions tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as the ocean and atmosphere slowly reach equilibrium. Sea level would continue rising for centuries or even millennia as ice sheets continue to respond to the warming that's already in the pipeline. It's uncomfortable to think about, but we've probably already committed ourselves to significant changes, even with the most aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, some ecosystem disruption is already baked in. The real question now is how much more we add to that. Every little bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every tenth of a degree matters when you're dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record teaches us that rapid climate change is incredibly hard on societies. The climate changes at the end of the last ice age, for example, contributed to the extinction of megafauna and forced major changes in human subsistence. Droughts during the Holocene epoch have toppled entire civilizations, and those were natural variations that societies had no control over. We're now causing changes that are potentially faster and larger than those natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many of whom live in areas that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, the implications are truly staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural regions face shifting rainfall patterns and more extreme weather events. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation patterns and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. And island nations could literally disappear beneath the waves. The humanitarian implications are enormous, and they're unequally distributed. Those who have contributed the least to causing climate change are often the most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about the climate now than we ever have before. We can see changes happening in real time thanks to satellites and monitoring systems. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy, and we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind power are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, although it's not yet proven at the necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, and navigating competing interests. That's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers the consequences. Solving it requires collective action on a scale that humanity has never before achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, the changes too slow, the obstacles too numerous. I understand that feeling, but humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, and created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem that requires unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that have controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this much influence. It's both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Future geologists, studying sediments millions of years from now, will see a clear marker. They'll see isotope ratios reflecting massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, and novel materials like plastics and concrete in the sediment. They'll recognize that something unprecedented happened during this brief moment in time. Whether they'll also see evidence that we successfully navigated the crisis, well, that's still an open question. The answer depends on what we do in the coming decades. The cycle reminds us that the climate is dynamic, sensitive to forcing, and full of feedbacks and tipping points. It's not a stable, unchanging background. It's an active system responding to inputs. For millions of years, those inputs were natural. Now, we're adding a new input, and the system is responding. We're living through a moment unlike any other in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. Never before has a single species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. The knowledge and the power are ours, a burden no organism has ever possessed. What we do with it will determine Earth's trajectory for thousands, perhaps millions of years. Of course, life is resilient. The Ice Age cycles have shown us that. Earth has endured dramatic climate shifts, and life has always found a way to survive, adapt, and even thrive. Life even survived the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. It survived ice ages. It will survive this too. The real question is whether human civilization, as we know it, will thrive. Or will we face massive disruptions that could have been avoided with foresight and decisive action? I began by discussing the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle and how scientists patiently unraveled it. That same scientific community now warns us about anthropogenic climate change, employing the very same methods that revealed the Ice Age cycles to us. If we can trust the science that explained the past, we can trust it to predict the future. And it's abundantly clear that we are pushing the system hard. We will see significant responses, and the window for avoiding the worst outcomes is rapidly closing. The Ice Age taught our ancestors to be adaptable and innovative. It's in our very DNA. We can harness those traits to navigate the challenge we've created, but we need to act collectively, and we need to act quickly. The climate system has momentum and time lags. Actions taken today won't show their full effects for decades, but inaction today commits us to changes that will unfold for centuries to come. Every year of delay makes the eventual response harder and more disruptive. So, where does that leave us? We are 11,700 years into an interglacial period that should eventually end. We are armed with an understanding of how climate works, and we are actively changing it faster than natural processes typically do. The 100,000-year cycle that shaped human evolution is being overridden by human activity. We've become a geological force. The only question now is whether we will use that power wisely or recklessly. The answer will determine what planet future generations inherit and whether they will view us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that sustained life for millions of years is still operating in the background. But for the first time, it might not matter, because for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it. And what we do with that power in the next few decades will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other species sharing this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question now is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors, who just had to survive the cycle, we have the power to shape it. That's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. Time to see what we do with it.